There's a type of body fat that behaves very differently from the fat most people worry about. It is not the fat you can pinch under your skin. It is not the fat that changes quickly when you diet or exercise harder for a few weeks. This fat sits deep inside your abdomen, wrapped around organs like the liver, pancreas, and intestines. Scientists call it visceral fat, and biologically, it behaves less like stored weight and more like an active metabolic organ. What makes visceral fat dangerous is not just where it is located, but how it interacts with the body's signaling systems. Unlike subcutaneous fat, visceral fat is densely packed with hormone receptors. These receptors constantly listen for biochemical instructions, particularly signals related to insulin and cortisol. In simple terms, visceral fat is not waiting for you to burn calories. It is waiting for your hormones to tell it whether energy should be stored or released. This is the point where most people misunderstand fat loss. The common belief is that body fat disappears when you push harder. You exercise longer, cut calories more aggressively, and expect the body to respond by breaking down fat stores. But visceral fat does not behave like a passive storage tank. It behaves like a defensive reserve. From an evolutionary perspective, this actually made perfect sense. Thousands of years ago, survival depended on having emergency energy available close to the body's vital organs. If food suddenly became scarce, or if the body faced danger, visceral fat could quickly supply fuel to the systems that kept you alive. Because of this role, your body protects visceral fat much more aggressively than other fat stores. And that protection is controlled by signals, not effort. When stress hormones are high, visceral fat cells receive a clear message. Hold on to energy. When insulin rises after eating, the message becomes even stronger. Store fuel and lock it away. These signals evolved to keep humans alive during unstable environments. The problem is that modern lifestyles unintentionally trigger these same signals almost every single day. Many people assume the body decides to burn fat overnight while they sleep. After all, the body has been fasting for several hours by the time morning arrives. But interestingly, the real metabolic decision often happens much earlier than that. It happens during the first hour after you wake up. This short window in the early morning quietly influences how your metabolism behaves for the rest of the day. Two people may eat similar meals, follow similar diets, and even exercise the same amount. Yet their results can be completely different simply because their mornings send different biological signals. Think of the body as constantly trying to answer a simple question. Is this environment safe enough to use energy, or is it unpredictable enough that energy must be stored? Your hormones answer that question before your conscious mind even starts planning the day. When you wake up, your body naturally shifts into a state designed to prepare you for activity. Cortisol begins to rise, helping increase alertness and mobilize energy. At the same time, your liver releases glucose into the bloodstream so that your brain and muscles have fuel available. If you have not eaten yet, insulin levels remain relatively low. This creates a brief metabolic window where energy is circulating in the blood but has not yet been directed into storage. During this moment, your body is essentially deciding what kind of day it believes it is entering. If the morning begins with stress, rushing, stimulation, or immediate food intake that rapidly raises insulin, the biological message is clear. Energy needs to be stored. Visceral fat responds by tightening its hold on its reserves, but if the morning begins differently, the message changes. When the body experiences calm movement, natural light, and gradual activation rather than stress, the metabolic environment shifts. Energy can be used rather than stored. Insulin remains relatively low. Glucose is absorbed by active muscles, and visceral fat is no longer chemically blocked from being accessed. This is where a surprisingly simple behavior becomes powerful. Gentle morning movement. Light walking shortly after waking up may look insignificant on the surface. It does not burn a huge number of calories. It does not feel like an intense workout. But metabolically, it interacts with the body at a very specific moment. When muscles contract during walking, they activate glucose transport mechanisms that do not rely heavily on insulin. One of the most important of these mechanisms involves the movement of GLUT4 transporters to the muscle cell surface. This allows muscles to pull glucose directly out of the bloodstream and use it for energy. The result is subtle but powerful. Instead of glucose building up in the blood and triggering a spike in insulin, the circulating energy is quietly absorbed and used. Insulin remains low, and when insulin stays low, visceral fat is no longer chemically locked away. At that point, the body gains access to a secondary fuel source, stored fat. This does not create a sudden burst of fat burning. That is another misconception often promoted by dramatic fitness messaging. Instead, it shifts the direction of metabolism. Over the next several hours, the body becomes more comfortable switching between glucose and fat as energy sources. Scientists often refer to this ability as metabolic flexibility. When metabolic flexibility improves, the body becomes less dependent on constant carbohydrate intake and more capable of using stored energy when needed. Visceral fat, which is particularly sensitive to insulin levels, becomes one of the first reserves to be gradually mobilized, and this is why timing matters so much. Walking itself is not the magic ingredient. What makes it powerful is the moment when it happens. Early morning movement interacts with hormone signals at a time when the body is already deciding how energy will flow throughout the day. When the signals are aligned correctly, the body does not need to be forced into burning fat. The biological conditions naturally allow it. But when the timing is wrong, even intense effort can produce the opposite effect. To understand why this early window matters so much, we need to look more closely at what your body is doing during the first hours of the day. When you wake up, your metabolism is already active. Hormones begin shifting before your eyes even open. Cortisol rises gradually to help transition the body from sleep into alertness, while the liver begins releasing glucose into the bloodstream to fuel brain activity and movement. This glucose release is a normal and healthy process. It ensures that your body has immediate energy available without requiring food right away. But what happens to that glucose in the minutes and hours after waking can dramatically influence the direction of your metabolism. If glucose remains circulating in the bloodstream for too long, the pancreas responds by releasing insulin. Insulin's role is to move that glucose into storage. It signals muscle cells, liver cells, and fat cells to absorb energy from the blood. Under normal circumstances, this is a useful process, but it also creates a metabolic side effect that most people do not realize. When insulin rises, the body temporarily shuts down access to stored fat. This happens because insulin acts as a storage signal. As long as insulin is elevated, the body interprets the environment as one where energy is abundant and should be conserved rather than released. In this state, fat oxidation slows down, and visceral fat becomes chemically inaccessible. This is why the early morning period is so important. Your body already has glucose circulating from the liver. If that glucose can be used quickly by active tissues such as muscle, insulin does not need to rise significantly. But if the glucose simply sits in the bloodstream while the body remains inactive, insulin will eventually increase to manage it. At that point, the metabolic window closes. The body shifts from energy usage into energy storage, even if you have not eaten very much. This is one of the reasons why sedentary mornings can quietly push metabolism toward fat preservation without people realizing it. The interesting part is that the body has a built-in mechanism that allows muscles to absorb glucose without relying heavily on insulin. This mechanism is activated through muscle contraction. When muscles move, they trigger signaling pathways that bring glucose transport proteins called GLUT4 to the cell surface. These proteins act like tiny doors that allow glucose to enter the muscle cell directly. Once inside the muscle, glucose can be used as fuel for movement. Because this process does not depend strongly on insulin, blood glucose levels can drop naturally without triggering a large hormonal storage response. That small shift creates a much larger metabolic consequence. With glucose being used by muscles and insulin remaining low, the body begins to rely more heavily on fat as an additional fuel source. Visceral fat, which is highly sensitive to insulin levels, becomes increasingly available. This does not mean the body suddenly burns massive amounts of fat in the morning. Instead, it changes the fuel preference of the metabolism. Over time, the body becomes more comfortable drawing energy from stored fat during the hours between meals. This gradual shift is far more powerful than short bursts of intense fat burning because it changes how energy is handled throughout the entire day. Another system that begins to respond to this early morning activity is the liver. The liver plays a central role in regulating blood sugar and energy distribution. When it senses that muscles are actively using glucose, it reduces unnecessary glucose production later in the day. This helps stabilize blood sugar levels across the afternoon and evening. Stable blood sugar leads to calmer insulin responses, and calmer insulin responses create an environment where fat remains accessible instead of constantly being locked away. At the same time, cortisol behavior becomes more balanced. Cortisol is often misunderstood as purely a stress hormone, but in reality it follows a natural daily rhythm called the cortisol awakening response. This morning rise helps increase alertness and mobilize energy. When morning activity is gentle and controlled, cortisol follows its natural curve. It rises enough to support energy and focus, then gradually declines throughout the day. However, when the morning begins with intense stress, aggressive workouts, or excessive stimulation, cortisol can spike sharply and remain elevated longer than intended. This prolonged elevation sends a defensive signal to the body. From a biological standpoint, high stress signals mean the environment may be unpredictable. In response, the body becomes more conservative with energy usage and more protective of stored reserves, including visceral fat. This explains a paradox that confuses many people. High-intensity exercise absolutely has benefits for cardiovascular health and muscle development, but when it is performed immediately after waking, especially in a fasted state and under psychological stress, it can create a hormonal environment that temporarily encourages the body to conserve energy afterward. In contrast, low-stress movement, such as relaxed walking, sends a very different message. Instead of triggering a defensive response, it signals that the body can safely transition from rest into activity. Energy is used smoothly, hormones remain stable, and the metabolic system stays flexible. This difference may appear subtle, but over weeks and months, it can lead to dramatically different outcomes. Small hormonal shifts repeated daily accumulate into large metabolic changes. People often look for dramatic strategies to lose visceral fat. Extreme diets, exhausting workout routines, or complicated metabolic protocols promise fast results. But the body rarely responds well to constant metabolic pressure. What it responds to far more reliably is consistent signaling. A calm, repeatable routine that begins the day with gentle movement, natural light exposure, and gradual energy use can quietly shift the entire metabolic tone of the day. The routine itself may only take 10 or 15 minutes, but the hormonal signals it sets in motion can influence energy metabolism for the next 12 hours. And this is the hidden leverage point most people never consider. Fat loss is not determined only by what you eat or how hard you train. It is also shaped by when your body believes energy should be used. When that decision is made correctly in the early morning, the rest of the day often follows naturally. By this point, the biological pattern should start to become clear. Visceral fat is not simply waiting to be burned through effort. It is responding to signals. Those signals are created through hormone balance, energy flow, and the timing of activity throughout the day. And the first signals the body receives after waking up often shape everything that follows. This is why a simple morning routine can quietly influence visceral fat metabolism for hours. But the effectiveness of this routine does not come from intensity or complexity. In fact, the more aggressive people try to make it, the less effective it often becomes. The goal is not to shock the body into burning fat. The goal is to create a metabolic environment where fat no longer needs to be protected. So what does that routine actually look like? The first step begins with light exposure. Within the first few minutes after waking, exposure to natural daylight helps synchronize the brain's central circadian clock located in the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This internal clock coordinates the rhythm of hormone release across the body. Morning light signals to the brain that the day has begun. As a result, cortisol follows its natural awakening curve, alertness increases, and metabolic processes begin aligning with daytime activity. This alone helps stabilize hormonal patterns that influence appetite, energy usage, and insulin sensitivity later in the day. The second step is gentle movement. Instead of remaining sedentary during the early morning period, the body benefits from calm physical activity that encourages muscles to begin using circulating glucose. This movement does not need to be intense. In fact, the most effective form is often simple walking. A relaxed walk for 10 to 20 minutes allows muscles to contract rhythmically without triggering a strong stress response. During this time, glucose transport mechanisms activate, muscles begin absorbing circulating glucose, and insulin remains relatively low. Because insulin stays low, stored fat remains accessible. This small metabolic shift may appear insignificant in the moment, but it quietly alters the direction of energy metabolism for the rest of the day. The third step is patience with food timing. Many people wake up and immediately eat, often consuming foods that raise insulin rapidly. When this happens, the metabolic window created by early movement can close very quickly. Allowing a short period of time between waking, moving, and eating can help maintain the low insulin environment that encourages fat accessibility. This does not mean skipping meals or forcing extreme fasting. It simply means giving the body time to transition naturally from sleep into activity before introducing large amounts of incoming energy. When these three elements combine light exposure, gentle movement, and gradual energy intake, the body receives a consistent biological message. Energy can flow. That message is the opposite of the one produced by rushed mornings filled with stress, stimulation, and immediate calorie intake. However, there are also several mistakes that can easily undermine this routine. One of the most common is turning the walk into a workout. People often assume that faster must be better. They increase their pace, add hills, wear weighted vests, or push themselves to the point of heavy breathing. The moment the body perceives the activity as stressful, the hormonal message changes. Stress hormones increase. Cortisol spikes sharply. The body interprets the situation as demanding and potentially threatening. When this happens, energy conservation becomes more important than energy release. As a result, visceral fat tightens its hold rather than loosening it. Another mistake involves excessive stimulation early in the morning. Large amounts of caffeine immediately after waking can amplify the body's stress response, especially when combined with physical activity. While moderate caffeine later in the morning may not cause problems, stacking stimulants on top of the cortisol awakening response can create unnecessary hormonal pressure. Instead of a calm metabolic transition, the nervous system is pushed into urgency. A third mistake is trying to extend the routine too far. Some people attempt to walk for long periods, skip meals entirely, or combine the routine with prolonged fasting. For certain individuals, this can create excessive energy stress. Blood sugar may fall too low, cortisol rises to compensate, and insulin later rebounds. Once again, the body receives mixed signals. The key principle is simplicity. The routine works because it aligns with natural physiology, not because it overwhelms the system. Short, calm, repeatable behaviors performed consistently will almost always produce better long-term metabolic outcomes than extreme strategies applied sporadically. Over time, the effects begin to accumulate. Morning glucose is handled more efficiently. Insulin responses become calmer. Energy levels feel steadier throughout the day. Appetite becomes more regulated, and the body becomes increasingly comfortable using stored fat between meals. Visceral fat does not disappear overnight, but when the hormonal environment repeatedly signals safety and stable energy usage, the defensive purpose of visceral fat begins to fade. Instead of clinging tightly to its reserves, the body gradually begins releasing them. This is the quiet biology of long-term fat loss. It does not rely on punishment, exhaustion, or extreme discipline. It relies on creating the right conditions for the body to function the way it was designed to. And sometimes those conditions are created through surprisingly small behaviors performed at the right time. So rather than asking how many calories you burned in the morning, a more useful question might be this: what message did your body receive? Did your morning begin with urgency, stress, and stimulation? Or did it begin with calm activation and controlled energy use? Those two beginnings may look similar from the outside, but internally, they lead metabolism in